Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Elizabeth Quiche. I'm the director of the Kenan Institute for Ethics, and it's my very great pleasure and my honor to welcome all of you to the 2004 Kenan Distinguished Lecture in Ethics. This lecture is designed to bring to campus every year a distinguished ethics scholar or practitioner whose remarks will address ethical issues of broad social and cultural significance. And we're fortunate indeed in our choice of both lecturer and topic this year. I'd like to thank a few of the people who made this lecture possible. First, we are thrilled to have here with us today Mrs. Betty Kenan, who is the chair of the William R. Kenan Jr. Fund for Ethics and whose commitment to the Kenan Institute makes everything that we do possible. So Betty, welcome very much. There's some other organizations, including several members of the vibrant network of organizations that I like to call Duke's Ethics Mafia, that have contributed to this event and to Professor Glover's visit, and I'd like to thank them as well. Many thanks to the Center for the Study of Medical Ethics and Humanities, to the Center for Genome Ethics, Law, and Policy, to the Duke University Center for International Studies, and to the Office of President Richard Broadhead. And last but certainly not least, I owe a debt of gratitude to the wonderful staff of the Kenan Institute who took care of all of the arrangements. Susan Brooks, Melanie Mitchell, Kelly Lowry, Sean Dina, our work study students who have been busily ushering you around, Olivia, Nina, and Suparna, and especially Doris Jordan, who despite being silenced by laryngitis today still managed to whisper important instructions to the rest of us. It's astonishing to reflect on how much the world, or perhaps more accurately our perception of the world, has changed in the aftermath first of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then more shockingly for many Americans in the wake of September 11th. We only need to think back to the summer of 1999 when the ethical issue that topped the headlines was Monica-gate to realize how the issues have deepened and darkened, the stakes grown immeasurably higher, and the need for thoughtful ethical reflection and guidance more urgent. And we look forward very much to our Kenan lecturer, Jonathan Glover's reflections. I'd like to invite Professor Alan Buchanan, Professor of Public Policy and Philosophy and a member of the Kenan Institute's Faculty Council, to introduce Jonathan Glover.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm honored to introduce Professor Jonathan Glover as this year's Kenan Distinguished Lecturer. I too want to thank the Kenan family for making Professor Glover's visit to Duke possible. Jonathan Glover is Professor of Ethics, King's College, University of London, and Director of the Center for Medical Law and Ethics. His career exhibits a rare unity of theory and practical engagement with public policy at the national and international levels. That is why he is a perfect choice for Kenan Distinguished Lecturer. His books include Responsibility, 1970, Causing Death and Saving Lives, 1977, I, The Philosophy and Psychology of Personal Identity, 1988, and most recently, Humanity, A Moral History of the 20th Century. In 1989, he chaired a European Union commission which issued a book-length report on fertility and the family, popularly known as the Glover Report. This important work did much to establish the value of moral philosophy for public policy deliberation. More recently, he's consulted with the World Health Organization on the issues of ethics and population health. Because Professor Glover has expressed a desire to leave plenty of time for discussion after his lecture, I'm going to keep this introduction very brief and focus mainly on what I take to be what is most distinctive in his work. Even this will be hard to do in brief compass, however, because his work is so exceptionally rich and multifaceted. However, I think it's fair to say that Professor Glover's greatest contribution has been to challenge the dominant conception of philosophical ethics, or as it's also called, moral philosophy. To a large extent, the dominant conception has been rather narrow, even cramped. Contemporary moral philosophers have tended to focus on the critical analysis of ethical principles and arguments in support of those principles, proceeding in a way that largely ignores both history and human psychology. Glover has expanded our conception of ethics in both regards. Perhaps the best example is his dark and splendid book, Humanity, A Moral History of the 20th Century. In it, he unflinchingly describes in concrete detail the horrors of total war and genocide that have stained the 20th century. But instead of simply pointing out the moral principles that have been violated in these horrific events, or rehearsing the various moral theories that undergird those principles, Glover asks two critical questions. First, what is it about us as human beings that makes such horrific behavior possible? Second, what resources lie within us for resisting our propensities toward evil? In brief, Glover enriches moral philosophy with moral psychology, a moral psychology of evil, but also of resistance to evil. With regard to the latter, the moral psychology of resistance to evil, Glover focuses mainly on sympathy as a constraint on our willingness to harm others. This opens the way for a consideration of the conditions under which sympathy flourishes or is stunted, and, crucially, upon the ways in which the reach of our sympathy can be either expanded or truncated. Glover's wide-ranging work exhibits many virtues: clarity, logical rigor, nuanced distinctions, and an unflinching commitment to the pursuit of truth, even when the truth is excruciatingly painful and shameful. Just as important, it exhibits sympathy in the best sense of the term, the ability to put oneself in the place of others, to appreciate their joys and pains, and to see oneself in others, even in those who stand condemned in our judgment. All of these virtues are exhibited in his teaching as well as his writings. He is a dedicated teacher who encourages and challenges his students, and one who nurtures independent thought in them. I'm confident that tonight's lecture will begin to convey not just the depth and richness of Professor Glover's thought, but also his humane sensibility as well. Thank you, Professor Glover.
Alan, thank you very much for that generous introduction. I believe it was Adlai Stevenson who, when being given an introduction that he thought was excessive, said, "I can hardly wait to hear what I've got to say." And I feel a bit like that. I also like to say thank you to the Kenan Institute for the invitation to come and give this lecture, which is a great honor. And also, in particular, to Elizabeth Quiche, who has been amazingly tolerant of my absolute hopelessness at all correspondence and communication about anything. And she's been extremely generous. When she sends me emails now, she puts on the top the bit that you read before deciding to open it or not. This really needs an answer. And I'm hugely grateful for the friendliness and tolerance, as well as for the invitation. I should say that I know from experience that I have to be rather cautious about interpreting any apparent responsiveness in you, the audience, to my lecture, as I was once rather badly caught out. I was invited by Martha Nussbaum to go and give a talk at Brown University to her philosophy and literature group. And I said that I didn't really write on philosophy and literature, and she said, "Oh, come on, what's your favorite novel?" So I said, Anna Karenina. And she said, "Right, I'll put you down for Anna Karenina and ethics." So I turned up at Brown, having reread Anna Karenina and put together some remarks on it. And one of the things I was saying towards the end of my talk was I was talking about Tolstoy's idea of seriousness, about how there are certain kinds of people Tolstoy greatly admires, who are serious about their lives and particularly push through small talk to talk about things that really matter to them. And I was saying that he likes people who do that and doesn't like people who spend their time saying fashionable things, saying things they hope to impress, and saying things that will further their career. And while I was saying this, I noticed one young man who looked absolutely riveted, staring at me while I was saying this. And I thought, well, at least there's one person my message is going home to. And I was not totally surprised when at the drinks afterwards, he came up to speak to me. And I have to admit to a slight pang of regret, because from his accent I could immediately tell he was English. And I have no prejudice against the English, but I'd in a way come over here to impress Americans. He said to me, there's something I would really like to talk to you if you have a few minutes. I'd like to talk to you about. And having said this thing about Tolstoy believing you should say what you really deeply mean and deeply care about, I was slightly apprehensive as to what he was going to say to me. I quite like it when people come out to me as gay, but I like to have known them more than a minute and a half before they do so. And I wondered what it was going to be. And he said, I've been in America now, I've been here in Providence for a year. And I find there's one thing I think about more and more. And I said, what's that? And he said, do you know McVitie's home wheat chocolate biscuits? And it turned out that he had sort of sized me up as someone who might send him the missing biscuits. And so I went back to England, and for about £10, I could buy quite a lot of these biscuits. And I put them in a package to send to him. Then found, of course, that £10 worth of biscuits cost about £20 worth of airmail postage. But having started on the thing, although it was economically a totally absurd project, I then mailed him this package of biscuits. And he then must have felt a bit guilty about this, because about 6 months later, I got a package of American cookies, which must have cost, say, $20, with about $30 worth of airmail postage on them. The only virtue of this encounter really at all is that it refutes that rather dismal economist's picture of what human beings are like as rational, self-interested calculators. But it has, as I say, also taught me that if I see any of you looking particularly riveted, I shan't misinterpret it. You're probably an English person who wants Marmite, which is... anyway. I want to start talking about, with some rather obvious remarks, really, to start with, about the world since 9/11. So I think we clearly do live in a very dangerous world, and I wish I had the answers to the problems thrown up by the dangerous world in which we live. But one of the things which 9/11 made extremely clear is that very small groups can do a huge amount of damage. And it only needs a few people, and really, they did it in a very low-tech way. And when one thinks what might happen if such groups get hold of nuclear weapons, it's just almost too terrifying to think about. We need to do something to police the world, both because of the dangers of terrorism and because of the spread of nuclear and other terrifying weapons, and because the world, as it's been set up in the period since the Second World War, hasn't on the whole succeeded, or has only sporadically succeeded, in containing the terrible things like the recent genocidal acts in Darfur, for instance. So we do need some kind of way of policing the world. And as I say, I'm stronger on the questions than on the answers, I'm afraid, about exactly what we should do to this. But one thought which does come to me is that the dangerous world we now live in is very like the state of nature as described by Thomas Hobbes, the 17th century philosopher, who was really alarmed and terrified by what he saw happening as the English Civil War in his lifetime broke out and then ran its course with so much loss of life. And he said that in the state of nature, in a world without a firm, strong government, without someone in charge, life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The one quotation that anyone who can quote from Hobbes at all knows. And he had reasons for this. He thought there were so many reasons that individual human beings had in a state of nature without a powerful government. They had so many reasons for fighting each other. On the one hand, if you have something I want and I'm stronger than you, then I have a reason to attack you and take it, in the absence of any law enforcement. But then if you know that I'm going to have that motive for attacking you, at a time when you're stronger than me, you have a motive for preemptive strike against me to stop me doing it. But if I know that you have both something I want and a motive for preemptive strike, I then have a motive to preempt your preemptive strike. And so the spiral of fear and violence goes on. Now, Hobbes' own solution was what he called Leviathan, the idea that there should be a contract between all the people giving power to one as the absolute ruler. There should be a total concentration of all power in the hands of one. So it was, in a way, a defense of tyranny. And he was aware of some of the evils of tyranny, but he thought that that was less terrible than allowing the unbridled violence that would come from the spiral of fear that he thought characterized the state of nature. Now, one can see the international world as in a way like a Hobbesian state of nature. And the Hobbesian solution, I suppose, the pure Hobbesian solution would be for all the countries of the world to get together and approach the strongest country, which is obviously the United States, and say, you run the world for us, we'll give all power to you. Or there's the evolving version, which is more plausible and more credible, that gradually a superpower emerges and dominates the world and keeps the peace through that domination. And there have been lots of cases in history, or a number of cases in history, Pax Romana, the Roman Empire, in the 19th century, Pax Britannica, and now Pax Americana. And one can see that the idea that the dominant superpower should be responsible for policing the world is an idea in the tradition of Hobbesian thinking. But there are various drawbacks to the Hobbesian solution, which I want to mention. One is that if this is how conflict is contained, it's only contained. Force can contain conflict, but it doesn't remove its roots. And one problem is that empires fall as well as rise, as one can see from talk about the Roman Empire or the British Empire. And so the problem isn't dealt with forever. It's only dealt with as long as the dominant power remains dominant and keeps, as it were, running to stay ahead of everyone else. Then again, there's the thought that empires act partly out of self-interest. So although it may be better to have the world policed by a superpower than not policed at all, the solution may not be just. I think, for instance, many Palestinians would feel that they couldn't rely on getting a fair deal if the United States is the world policeman. And then there's a third drawback, which was noted by Immanuel Kant when he wrote on Hobbes, which is the lack of any kind of moral authority. And he put forward a scheme for an international federation of nation-states, because his point is that if it's just the dominant, if it's just the powerful countries that police the world, there's no moral authority. Their only authority is the force and power that they have. And the point can be made now by saying no one appointed the United States to be a world policeman, no one appointed NATO or the European allies to be world policemen, and the Hobbesian solution seems to be a matter of simply saying might is right. And Kant tried to solve this problem with his idea of a federation of nation-states. He saw that a world government running everything goes against what most people want. Most people do not want to have to give up their own nationhood, their own nation-state. but he wanted to give a monopoly of the use of force to the Federation of States. And then the moral authority was to be derived from the fact that the Federation would be impartial, or at least impartial to a degree that was less likely if it was just the strongest power, and it would also have the moral authority of being set up by agreement. And I suppose the modern version of this would be a somewhat idealized version of what the United Nations is now. Not somewhat idealized, hugely idealized, because what one would need if one wanted to implement the Kantian solution rather than the Hobbesian solution, one would need a United Nations police force of overwhelming strength. And one of the striking things about, say, the UN interventions in what used to be Yugoslavia was often the UN people would find themselves being dictated to by the local Serbian commander in a way that Hobbes didn't envisage would happen to Leviathan. There'd have to be overwhelming strength and also adequately funded. And also there would need to be a better arrangement for deciding what sort of interventions are undertaken. Because in the present UN, everything depends upon self-interested views of particular governments who are in the Security Council. One would need something like a set of agreed criteria for intervention, which were laid down, and some kind of world court which would adjudicate on particular cases and authorize the intervention. Now, this may sound very utopian, and I'm not for a minute suggesting that this is something which we can implement straight away, but I want to suggest that something along these lines should be kept in mind as a sort of regulative ideal which we should aspire to move towards, even if gradually. People often say we live in a global village, and it seems to me a half-truth at best. I mean, but insofar as it is partly true, one of the things about villages is that they come in two kinds. There are villages where, when violence breaks out, the rule of law holds, and you call the police, and the police arrive in sufficient strength to put down the violence and arrest people who are responsible for it. And the other kind of village, what might be called a sort of mafia village, perhaps from Sicily or somewhere like that, would be where there isn't a strong police force and where you have to rely on the strongest and most powerful citizens getting together a posse and imposing an end to the quarrel by that. And it seems to me clear that it's preferable in the interests of moral authority and in terms of long-term stability of the world to move towards a situation where the global village has some kind of rule of law, rather than simply quarrels being sorted out by intervention by people whose only credentials really are their strength. Now, this, I think, it may sound a highly utopian suggestion. Parts of the solution are already perhaps evolving with the international courts that already exist, ideas about international criminal courts to try people for genocide and things of that sort. The strategy I want to suggest is that we should have the Kantian solution in mind as the ideal one and support gradual evolution towards it. We should learn to adapt ourselves to cope with the terrible disasters that we've experienced in the 20th century and sadly in the first few years of the 21st. We should learn from these disasters in the same way that the medical profession learned from the Nazi atrocities in creating regulations, a whole machinery for regulating medical research, for instance, to protect human subjects. And we all know that after the Nazi atrocities, the horrible Nazi human experimentation, we all know that the system of regulation isn't perfect. There are still cases of abuses and horrors, but we all know also that it's much better to have the imperfect system of control that's been set up in the world, where you can't get your stuff published unless it's cleared by an ethics committee and so on. That's better than having no regulation at all. So I'm proposing that we should slowly try to move towards the internationalist solution for policing the world. But I think that the political strategy needs to be supplemented by thinking more about the psychological causes of the conflicts that divide our world. So now I want to talk a bit about the psychological roots of conflict and to ask some questions about whether there are ways in which we can do something about these psychological roots. I'm going to be talking about two particular kinds of conflict, partly about systems of belief, whether religious or political ideologies, and the contribution they make, and I'll just talk briefly about that. And then I'm going to talk a bit more about tribalism, the tribal psychology that sees members of other groups as alien and makes us hostile towards them. These two, of course, often overlap. In talking about these, I'm homing in on what I take to be centrally psychological causes of conflict. I don't for a minute want to deny that there are other conflicts that are much less purely psychological. There are often economic causes. People struggle, as in Israel and Palestine, people struggle for the same land. If there's a shortage of water, that's going to fuel conflicts and so on. But I want to talk about these because I think these are fairly central. So first I want to talk about ideological conflict, the fact that people with two different systems of belief often find it hard to live together, often hostile to each other, often think the other system of belief has to be eradicated. The first thing I would say is a mildly optimistic and cheerful thing, which is that people with different systems of belief, of course, can live in peace. We all know how, in a complex society like the United States, people have many, many different views about religion, and although occasionally there are unpleasant episodes of violence, on the whole, people have learned to live together despite very deep differences of belief. And even where there have been wars, I think it's very striking that in the 17th century, Europe was torn by the conflict between Catholics and Protestants. It was as deep a conflict as the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, for instance, or between extreme Islamists and others. And yet, somehow that died out. And I take it that a lot depends on, partly it may have died out, this is the less cheerful thing, through sheer exhaustion and sheer loss of life and sheer we can't take it anymore. But the fact that some of these conflicts can die out and people can learn to live together is something we should try to take some courage from and try to learn from. A great deal, of course, depends on how the beliefs are held. On the one hand, there's fanaticism, together with proselytizing and denunciation of people who disagree. And on the other hand, there's tolerant understanding that people have different points of view and a reluctance to claim a monopoly of the truth. And one can see this very clearly. I mean, I was very struck in the period after 9/11, on the one hand, the appalling fanaticism of the statements Al-Qaeda made, attempting to justify that terrible series of atrocities. And on the other hand, in King's College London, the Islamic students I talked to who were enraged and depressed that their religion had been hijacked by these horrible fanatics to do this, and fear that they would be stigmatized because they were members of the same religion as these fanatics. I want to just make one suggestion about a way in which, I mean, I'm not coming with any easy formulas to tell you this is the solution to these ideological conflicts, but I want to suggest one way in which academics, and particularly people interested in philosophy, could, I think, make more of a contribution than up to now we have. There's a great deal of the history of philosophy has been about what kinds of belief are well-founded. When you and I have different beliefs about something, how can we tell who's right if either of us is? What's the basis for our belief? And of course, philosophers have pursued this right down to absolute fundamentals. How do I know there's a world outside my mind at all? Couldn't it just be a whole piece of virtual reality? If I do know there's a world outside my mind, do I know the truths of science, or is science just the local belief system of the Western world? What are the answers to these questions? Now, in philosophy, this part of philosophy known as epistemology, the theory of knowledge, people have argued about these questions for thousands of years. And I believe some progress has been made. And what I'm struck by is that when I teach this part of philosophy to students, they hope that I will have answers to give them at first. They hope that by the time their exam comes round, I will have told them what the answers to these questions are so they can write these answers in the exam. But in fact, what they soon discover is that I don't know the answers. And they end up, I think, with a mixture, with sometimes a degree of disappointment that it hasn't been like learning basic chemistry, where you end up with some pretty well agreed results. But on the other hand, there's something encouraging that I notice about them, which is although they come to very different views from each other about what the answers are to these questions, their answers are more tentative, more cautious, more tolerant. They're less inclined, after seeing how very difficult it is to establish these basic assumptions we make about the world, they're more willing to be open-minded and a good deal less dogmatic. And my belief is that if that part of philosophy could be made a really central part of education everywhere, not just in the United States or in my country or in other parts of Western Europe, but if that could be seen as part of an understanding of what it is to be educated, this could start to weaken the tendencies towards fanaticism and dogmatic, intolerant kinds of belief. It used to be said in the British Army, maybe something similar was said in the United States Army, I'm not sure. It used to be said in the British Army that in the mess where people used to go to eat together, where the soldiers would go to eat together, there were three things you weren't allowed to talk about. The third one dates this saying very much. But you weren't supposed to talk about religion or politics or women. Now, of course, these days there are women in the mess, and so this idea that women are simply there to be fought over by men has rightly taken a bit of a back seat. But the idea that you shouldn't talk about religion and politics, the idea was that if you want people to get on and to work together in the army as colleagues and friends and support each other, you ought not to divide them by religion and politics. And I understand that thought, but I think that one of the things that philosophy might have to contribute is to encourage people to develop a style of talking about deep differences of belief that is respectful and at the same time critical, that is tolerant, friendly, probing. What are the differences between your beliefs and mine? Is there any way we can think of where we might be able to settle our deep disagreement? If there isn't, what does that say about the status of our beliefs? It seems to me those kind of questions that ought not to be kept just in the university, but ought to move out into the world. Now I want to move away from the idea of ideologies and belief systems as causes of conflict to talk about another main cause of conflict, which is tribalism. And as part of that, I want to talk a bit about the psychological links which I believe exist between, on the one hand, being humiliated and, on the other hand, being aggressive and violent. I have been spending quite a bit of time over the last few years interviewing people in a psychiatric hospital in England called Broadmoor. Broadmoor is a hospital where people only go when they've got not only a psychiatric diagnosis, but also they've committed some very serious crimes. I mean, it makes a big point that it's a hospital, not a prison. But sometimes I think you could have fooled me. I mean, when I go to make my have my appointment with the patient who I'm interviewing, I meet nurses who aren't the sort of people I used to fantasize about when I was 17, but are tough-looking young men in black uniforms whose trade union is the Prison Officers Association. But anyway, I go to interview people who have a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. At the extreme end, there's a thing called the Hare psychopathy checklist, and if you score very high, you're a psychopath. If you score less high, you only have antisocial personality disorder, but the antisocial personality disorder includes both groups. And my project was to go to interview them about their thinking about ethics, their thinking about right and wrong. Because one of the things said about this group of people is that they have no conscience. And that's always fascinated me since I've been teaching ethics for years. Saying someone has no conscience seems to me to raise more questions than it answers. Does it mean they don't feel guilt? Or does it mean they can't imagine how other people feel when they hurt them? Or does it mean they can imagine but don't care, or even take pleasure in it? Or does it mean they don't have certain moral concepts like unfair, cruel, unjust, selfish? Or does it mean that they don't have a conception of the sort of person they want to be, a sense of their own moral identity, a sense of some values that shape the picture they might have of who they want to be, what they want to be like? So I go in and ask them questions about all this. I deliberately don't ask them about the crime that got them in there, because I think that would be threatening and it's not part of my project. I'm there to ask them how they think about ethics. So I ask them, for instance, did you drive before you got in here? And they usually say yes. And I say, did you take your car to do your shopping sometimes? They say yes. And I say, did you park in the disabled space? And if they say yes, I want to know why. If they say no, I want to know why. And that's even more interesting, because there are so many different reasons one might have for not parking in the disabled space. I mean, I admit some of them are rather discreditable reasons, and I admit I have a mixture of the good reasons and the bad for why I don't park in the disabled space. And the not very admirable reasons are you might get your wheel clamped by somebody. Or second, hardly better than that as a reason, is the thought that I mean, I have this thought particularly because my job has the slightly absurd description, professor of ethics. And if the neighbours saw me getting out of my car in the disabled space, that would obviously be very embarrassing. Well, those are rather self-interested reasons. But there are other better reasons, like one might say, you feel sorry for the people who are disabled, that they would have to walk further taking their shopping, and that's hard on them. Or you might say, they have a right to it and I don't. Or you might say, I don't want to be the sort of person who's so mean as to park in the disabled space. Well, those are the sorts of things I'm looking for and trying to explore. But what I find is that although I start with my questions, the people I'm interviewing take over. And this is perhaps some incompetence in me as a psychological interviewer, but they desperately want to tell me certain things. They often want to tell me about their crime, and so I listen to that. And then they often want to tell me about their childhood. And what I really want to talk about is the appalling incidents among the people I interview of nightmare childhoods in which they have been rejected and humiliated. And of course, one of the methodological problems if you're interviewing this group of people is that they are notorious liars and con men. And so I have to put up a caveat that, of course, on the whole, I think I can tell by the way they talk who's trustworthy and who's not. But that may just be that some are more subtle than others. But the psychiatrists in Broadmoor give me the same account. They say if you look at the record, about 80% of the people in Broadmoor have been abused in some terrible way during their childhood. And I want to just read you some of the answers I've got to when I've been asking them questions, to bring out the links between being humiliated as a child and later violence. One of them says, well, I knew it was wrong, but there was a lot of, I'm not sort of mitigating, but I was getting married the next day, and it's a long story, really. Whenever things are going well, I sort of always muck them up, mess them up. And I say, do you want to tell me how it happened or not? Well, I had to go and get my suit, and there was different things we had to pay for. My girlfriend was going on about this, that, and the other, and what needed to be paid for, money, bills, not just bills, but like for this wedding and that. And I went out and I'd done a burglary, and when I was in there and I saw all these pictures, all these happy families, you know, and I smashed the place up and set fire to it. And I asked, was it the pictures of the happy families that triggered that? Yeah, I think so, yeah. Was that because you felt you hadn't had a happy family? Well, I know I haven't had a happy family, but it's just all my life, everything's always gone wrong. It just feels, well, that's how it is. But when things are going right, I know things are just going to go wrong. And many of them describe childhoods in which they were shown very little love. The common theme is rejection and humiliation. One of them says, I was abused sexually and physically abused constantly, and I was in hospital for 11 years with polio, and they only came to see me once. I hated myself for the things my mother did to me and my stepbrother. I thought it was all my fault, that I was the one that was doing the wrong. My mother would be in my head, saying I was rotten, I should kill myself, I don't deserve to live, and all the rest of it, and that sort of stuff. And another one says, and so I wasn't shown no affection. And it actually got to me, because the first day I was taken to school by my mother, and then after that she actually left me to come home. And I couldn't understand why all the other parents were coming and picking their kids up. Why don't I get picked up? That's what I must have felt, because I used to, on one occasion I smashed all the milk bottles to draw attention from all them other people. And I think that one of the things which I find emerging from the interviews I have, and this is highly intuitive, it's a fairly small sample, I've interviewed about 30 people so far, but I think I find just impressionistically coming out of these interviews is that the humiliation and rejection of childhood creates in them a tremendous need for recognition and respect, and that in turn is part of what leads to the violence. One of them says, with the anger, with how cocky I used to be, with the beer, it boiled up, and I was just like an animal. People was frightened of me, and I loved it. And I asked, why did you love that? I don't know, it was stupid. I asked, was it a kind of recognition, respect? Yeah, people used to go, hi, Ray. I used to be noticed. Hi, Ray. All right, Ray, have a drink, Ray. And I asked, when you look back on the person you were before, what do you think you had missing? I think the biggest thing is to be needed for myself, not for what I was. I mean, I went to the pub if I had a lot of money. People needed me, or I thought they did, but it wasn't the case. I mean, it was a big bravado thing, because I'd done a lot of armed robberies and I never got caught. So there's plenty of money about and fast cars and that, and I was living, you could say, extremely in the fast lane. And I felt people were looking up to me. And another one says, you build up this defensive wall, and you don't let no one or nothing into it. You know, I was out to prove myself all the time. And I had a lot of violent things done to me, like initiation into teddy boys meant you had to have your legs cut, and things happened with knives and stuff like that. But to me that was bravado, that was like badges of honor. Like you go to Scouts and get a badge for doing this, to me. And so I say, you're saying you wanted respect, is that right? Not so much respect, but I wanted recognition. Yeah, I suppose I felt thinking about it. I felt I was a nobody. But being with these people, I was a somebody. And even when I got stitched up, I used to take the stitches out because I didn't want it closed up. I wanted wounds to show and stuff like that. Now, what I want to suggest is that it seems intuitively right, partly because of this, but partly just from experience we may have with people who have been treated harshly. It seems that humiliation leads to anger. The boy who smashed the milk bottles when his mother didn't come to collect him from school. And the anger is one route to violence. And then there's also the hunger for recognition and respect, which leads to violence, because if you're a young man and your peer group are people who look up to people who are violent, then that's another route to violence. And I think that's also the point that learning recognition and respect usually takes place in a reciprocal context. You learn to respect other people and to recognize other people, give them recognition, because you get it yourself. It's a two-way process. And if you don't get it yourself, it's hard to see how you're likely to learn what recognition and respect are. Now, what I want to suggest is that you may think, what's all this got to do with New World Order and tribalism? But what I want to suggest is that the tribal conflicts that take place, although often they're about economic things or land or something like that, there's normally a huge element of the need for recognition in these tribal conflicts. one of the things I'm struck by, when I talk to Israelis and to Palestinians, I get an extraordinary sense of similarity, in one respect at least, that both groups, if you talk to them, and of course they're not a monolithic group, but some who I've talked to, some Israelis and some Palestinians, you get the impression that they feel that the whole world is against them and that no one wants to hear their side of the story. And they have the sense of their story not being recognized. They're getting no recognition. The Palestinians believe that the dominant power in the world, the United States, is on the side of Israel. The Israelis tend to believe that most Europeans are anti-Semitic and against Israel and on the Palestinian side. And both sides tend to believe that it's very hard for their case to get listened to, get a proper hearing, and treated with sufficient respect. And I think that there are good reasons to believe that, particularly when one group has been either defeated or humiliated, then that strengthens the feeling. It's a bit like what I was saying with the people I'm interviewing, that humiliation and defeat tend to arouse the same anger, resentment, the same desperate need for recognition. We'll show them what it's like. Friedrich Schiller, the poet, called nationalism a phenomenon of the bent twig. This is something which Isaiah Berlin has revived as an influential idea. The idea being that when you walk through the trees, it's not very nice being especially if they're young trees with thin branches that you can push aside. It's not very nice being the second person walking through the woods behind somebody else, because the first person pushes the branch, and then the branch snaps back in the face of the second person coming. And Schiller said that this is what nationalism is like. It's when somebody has been humiliated that it then springs back in this sort of way. And I think that there's reason to think that he was right. I mean, very strikingly, if one looks, say, at the history of German nationalism, the intellectual origins of German nationalism were in Gottlob Fichte's nationalist addresses to the German people, which he actually gave as lectures in 1807 in Berlin when it was occupied by Napoleon's armies. So he was talking in a defeated Germany, and that was the origin. His addresses to the German people was the classic 19th century text on German nationalism and the stirring up people to care about the fact they were German and to assert themselves. And one sees rather the same sort of thing with German nationalism later on. The humiliation of the defeat in the First World War and the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty that imposed on Germany the humiliating war guilt clauses where Germany had to accept total responsibility for the outbreak of the First World War. This led to a huge amount of resentment. I confess to having wasted rather more of my time than I now think sensible on reading Hitler's Mein Kampf. I wouldn't want to do it again, I have to say. But it was, in a way, interesting to read it once. And one of the things which you can't but come away with is the impression of boiling anger and resentment, and particularly when he talks about the defeat at the end of the First World War, and he searches for a scapegoat and he says that the Jews were responsible for a stab in the back. But this boiling anger seems part of the response to the humiliations of the defeat, and the fact that he was able to come to power in Germany suggests that that note struck a chord in many, many other people. And one sees the same history between, for instance, people in Serbia and in Croatia. Each of them has their story, emphasizing endlessly the defeats at the hands of the other people. The Serbs talk about the horrible things that were done to them by the Croatians during the Nazi period, when the Croatians were on Hitler's side. The Croatians talk about the way in which they think Tito's communist regime was overwhelmingly Serbian and they were defeated. And rather interestingly, in the revival of the horrible Balkan Wars in the 1990s, you find that many of those who led the Serbian war against Croatia were those with personal family grievances against Croatians. General Mladic, his father, had been killed by the Croatian Ustaše. General Adzic, as a boy, had hidden in a tree while the Ustaše hacked his parents to death. And Milan Kovacevic, who in the 1990s ran Serbian concentration camps, had himself been born in a Croatian concentration camp. And these resentments perpetuate each other. Just as these Serbians were inspired, if that's the right word, to get revenge by their humiliation and cruelty they had suffered at the hands of the Croatians, one can imagine what Croatians who suffered in their concentration camps will want to do in 20 or 30 years' time. Now, I'm suggesting that quite a lot of tribal conflict is about recognition. Quite a lot of it is not just economic, but is about humiliation, being listened to, commanding respect, and those kinds of things. I'm saying in a way that conflict is partly Hegelian. I mean, Hegel was the great philosopher of identity, recognition, and respect. Well, Kant was perhaps the great philosopher of respect, but Hegel the great philosopher of identity and recognition. And I'm saying that conflicts are in a way Hegelian in this way often, as well as or instead of Marxist in the sense of being economic. And in one way this is a good thing, because while economic things are in short supply, respect doesn't have to be. Respect is something which there may be enough, if we are imaginative and creative, there may be enough respect to go around for everyone. I mean, for instance, in recent times, the demand for respect and recognition by Afro-Americans is not in conflict with the same demand for recognition and respect by gays and lesbians. Indeed, they can be on the same side and saying we are groups who together have been excluded from recognition and respect in the past, and we can see each other as allies in demanding recognition and respect together now. I mean, it doesn't always go as well as that, but that, I think, is one of the good things about conflicts being partly about recognition and respect. On the other hand, there's something bad about this too, and that is that they are often psychologically very intractable. It's not clear you can just lay on respect between Israelis and Palestinians. It's terribly hard to see quite what to do. But what I want to suggest is that a lot of conflicts in different parts of the world share a common pattern. They may have economic components as well, but they share this tribal sense of having been humiliated, of wanting recognition and respect. And to some extent, we ought to be able to draw on the experience of some conflicts in order to help ourselves understand others. And one of the heartening things I've thought in recent years was at the time of the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, where our local tribal conflict in the islands I come from has been raging for a long time. People came from South Africa to try to help, to try to say that they had managed to sort out, to some extent at least, their conflicts, that somehow after the ending of apartheid, instead of revenge in the style of the Balkan Wars I'm talking about, instead there was a real deep attempt at reconciliation, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, Nelson Mandela wearing the football shirt of the Springboks, which had been the great symbol of white racism and apartheid in earlier times. And the people from South Africa came to try to help in the reconciliation process in Northern Ireland. And I want to suggest just a couple of things which academics might consider, and these are just throwaway suggestions. I told you I haven't got the simple, neat solution to these deep problems. I wish I had. But I want to suggest the kind of thing which we might start thinking about to explore in trying to defuse the psychological components in these conflicts. One of them is inspired by the thing I just said about South Africans coming to help in Northern Ireland. It might be a good educational project to invite a group of Israelis and a group of Palestinians. I just choose that because that's a highly salient conflict. I mean, it could equally be Greeks and Turks in Cyprus, or Armenians and Azerbaijanis, or you name the region and you'll see a conflict there which is relevant. But it might be an educational value to get a group of Israelis and Palestinians to go and study another conflict, for instance, the Northern Ireland conflict, to get them to go and talk to people on the nationalist side, people on the unionist side, to do interviews, to explore the history together, to talk about it, with the simple constraint that they would have to produce an agreed report between them on what the psychological origins, particularly, of that conflict actually are. And, of course, there are all sorts of problems. Who would moderate the discussion? Isn't there a danger one side would identify with the nationalists and one side with the unionists? There are all sorts of pitfalls. I'm just suggesting this is the kind of thing worth maybe trying out. But I'd also want it to be filmed for television, because, of course, if you take a dozen Israelis and a dozen Palestinians, well, you've educated 24 people, but that's going to be a rather slow process if you're trying to change the world. But if you film the whole process, you might be able to produce something that can be shown all over the world and contribute to the education of people about how conflicts can really be understood. And the second project I have in mind is, again, I'll take the Israelis and Palestinians because that's a conflict highly familiar to all of us. Some of you may remember about several years ago, there were two episodes that happened in the Palestine-Israel conflict, which the pictures went round the world. The first was that a young Palestinian boy, aged about 10, was crouching there, trying to hide behind his father to avoid the Israeli bullets, the bullets from the Israeli soldiers, and he was shot. And the pictures went round the world and everybody was horrified. A week or two later, two young Israeli men strayed over a boundary and got into Palestinian territory, and they were then taken inside a building, and they died by being literally torn apart by a hostile crowd. Now, when we think of those two episodes, and we all know there have been lots and lots and lots of things like that since, but I just want to focus on those two because they came very close to each other, and I think they were probably related. When we think about that, I mean, the obvious reactions are to be aware of the tragedy and the horror of those events. But I want to suggest that there's an additional dimension to the tragedy, which is that each of those events will be remembered by one side and not by the other. The Israelis will remember the policeman being torn apart and will tend to gloss over the boy being shot by the Israeli soldiers, and the Palestinians will tend to gloss over the Israeli young men being torn apart and will remember their young boy being shot by the Israeli soldiers. And it's all too easy to see how these feed into these narratives, which both sides tell. These narratives lead them to say things. One side will say, we can't ever make peace with them, they deliberately kill our children. And the other side will say, we can't ever make peace with them, they're savages, they tore our young men apart. And those stories fuel these conflicts. Those stories are almost the heart of these conflicts, I sometimes think, insofar as they're psychological. And so what my idea of a possibly educational project, these things are small, but I think we have to start with small beginnings. A possibly educational project would be to get a group of Israelis and a group of Palestinians, and this time at first to get them to work separately. And you'd invite both of them to make a film. The Israelis would make a film about the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and the Palestinians would make their film about the history too. And they could use the most powerful emotional things they wanted. Israelis could talk about the effects so visible in the 20th century of the Jews being the only people without a country, what happened to them in Germany, how many refugees came and found refuge in Israel. They could talk about the ways in which all the Arab countries refused to make any room for them. They could tell that story. And the Palestinians could tell their story about how the Israelis came and drove them out, about how the Israelis have had this powerful backing from the United States and so have had a far more powerful army and have been able to take more and more of what used to be Palestinian land. Both sides could tell their stories and be encouraged to make a film telling their story as powerfully as possible, interviewing victims on their side, making the most powerful case they could. And the next stage of the project would be to get them to come together and to talk, show each other their films and to talk about their films. And again, with a sympathetic moderator or group of moderators, to ask them a question which would be, would it be possible, is there such a thing as historical objectivity? Would it be possible to make a film which would tell the story as God might tell it, or if you don't believe in God, as Tolstoy might tell it? I'm a Tolstoyan, and I'm not a religious believer, so for me, Tolstoy has to stand in as substitute. But I think one of the remarkable things about Tolstoy is the way in which he shows you so many different people from the inside. Would it be possible to make a film which did justice to all the powerful things, including the emotions, shown in the two separate films? And after discussing the philosophy of historical objectivity for a bit, the next stage would be for them to go away and try to make that film together. And I don't know whether this would work. And once again, of course, it's no good educating about 30 people. You'd have to film the whole process, each stage, so that the whole world could know whether or not, or to how far it would be possible to transcend the narrowness of only understanding your own story and not being able to hear the other. Now, these may seem rather puny projects compared to the huge size of the problems that face us in the world, but I think that we desperately need something else, however small the beginnings. We desperately need something else to take us away from the idea that the only response to conflict is to respond with violence and war ourselves. Going back from the psychology to the politics for a moment, I believe that the international solution, the Kantian solution to policing the world, is the only one that stands any chance of avoiding the bent twig reaction. I mean, insofar as one might believe that the war in Iraq was a piece of policing the world because of the worries about weapons of mass destruction, it seems to me clear that the fact that it's the United States and Britain and other countries is likely to lead to a bent twig resentment among Iraqis against people who are seen as alien invaders, in a way that possibly an adequate international police force exercise might not have been. I think this is the only way of avoiding the cycle of bent twig violence, is to have some kind of impartial equivalent of calling the police rather than leaving neighbours to sort it out. Now, I know that the Kantian solution may seem utopian, but I have one encouraging thought to offer you. If I look back on the early 20th century, what Europe, the continent I come from, what Europe gave to the world was colonialism, 2 world wars, and a genocide. And I think during that period, it would have seemed extraordinarily utopian to imagine the European Union as it is now. Now, I think that there are all sorts of defects in the European Union. It isn't nearly democratic enough. It's incredibly bureaucratic. It's filled with idiotic regulations about what kind of cheese you can sell and this kind of thing. But at the deep level, I'm a believer in the European Union because I think it's a way of avoiding the conflicts that disfigured the history of Europe in the 20th century. And that came about because we Europeans experienced the alternative. We discovered what it was like if you didn't have a proper arrangement to regulate relationships between nation states in Europe. And my hope is that Kant's proposal for a world federation may also come about, but this time without our having to experience the alternative. I really hope that, because the alternative is likely to be really terrible. Thank you.
I'm Noah Pickus, the Associate Director of the Kenan Institute, and I have a simple job, which is to field questions. Professor Glover will answer them, but I will field them. So if you want to, are you mic'd?
Yes, I am, yes.
All right,
So I I could be over here.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Now, I think what you say has a great deal of truth in it. I should say, when I talk about tribalism, sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. I should repeat the question. The question was really, am I bracketing off, correct me if I get you wrong, but am I bracketing off education and psychology, taking them out of context, because the real context is often one of inequalities of power. And so it may be that it's utopian to talk about psychological techniques of reconciliation when one needs to do something to address the inequalities of power. Is that fair? What I want to say about that is, yes, I'm sure that there are some conflicts where it's extremely difficult to get proper educational projects of the kind I believe in going, just because the most powerful side has no particular reason to listen to the other. I mean, I think that, for instance, Russia and Chechnya are a striking case where Russia has such huge power that it feels it can do more or less what it likes in Chechnya. I agree, there are certain severe limitations, and certainly inequalities of power need to be addressed, although on my World Federation scheme, there won't be, if that ever comes about, there won't be inequalities of military power, because military power will have been handed over to the Federation. But of course, if we're talking realistically, we're talking about what I may optimistically call the interim period, which may be a very long period before that happens. And I agree, there's a real problem about power, but sometimes stronger countries are willing to engage in dialogue. I mean, I don't want to boast particularly about my own country, which has a record as murky as many, but I think the move for Indian independence under Gandhi, Britain with its empire at that stage, was enormously more powerful than India, but somehow some kind of dialogue did manage to take place. But I agree, your question seems to me absolutely right. That's a severe limitation on the project, I accept that.
Alan, I neglected to say that we have two microphones, which we asked you to use. If you raise your hand, Doris and Savani will bring them around. Alan, here.
I admire the hopefulness of your presentation. Often I'm accused of being too hopeful and idealistic, so now I'm going to reverse the roles and throw some skeptical doubt in what you're saying. With respect to the Kantian World Federation idea, you emphasize there would be two pillars of legitimacy. One is consent or agreement, and the other is impartiality or justice in the actions that are performed. My worry is that these things come apart in our world. That is, that it would be very difficult to get a regime that would make decisions, say, about humanitarian intervention that exhibited the virtue of impartiality if consent were required, if by consent you mean universal consent. Let me give you an example. Presently, a representative from Libya is chair of the Human Rights Commission at the UN. Now, this is in the name of inclusiveness and making the UN a consent-based, universal kind of operation. But of course, there's good reason to believe that many countries in the world today are not very good at exhibiting impartiality or a sense of justice when they're dealing with anybody, including their own citizens, much less the citizens of other countries. You mentioned the European Union as a model, but what's striking about the European Union is that it's a very selective organization. It's not an organization that's achieved all of the good things that you rightly attribute to it by being universal and requiring agreement all the way around. So that's the first tension that I see. Maybe it's hard to combine those two pillars of legitimacy. The other has to do with recognition. You were saying that you thought that recognition was not in short supply, that it needn't be a zero-sum kind of phenomenon, or what economists call a positional good, that my having it depends upon your not having or having less of it. I think that's true for some kinds of recognition and respect. But what I worry about is that the kinds of recognition and respect that are involved in nationalist conflicts are precisely not that way. That is, if you look at what sort of respect, say, the Serbian extreme nationalist is looking for, they're looking for a recognition of the superiority of Serbia vis-a-vis Croatia because of historical events that have occurred. And where the nationalist tensions are greatest, they are between a particular group and a particular other. And often, I think the only kind of recognition that each group wants is recognition of superiority, that is submission, a recognition that my group was the one that was historically wrong and your group was the group that wronged. So I think it's dangerous to try to make generalizations across all different kinds of respect and recognition. I think nationalist respect and recognition are more likely to be in short supply because they are more likely to be positional goods than other kinds of respect or recognition.
I'm assuming that because you had the microphone, I don't need to repeat the question. Did you So it's really two questions, isn't it? The first one is about the tension between being impartial and being universal. Does the international authority I envisage the UN possibly growing into, can that both be inclusive and at the same time have the authority that comes from impartiality? Now, I absolutely agree that under the present UN arrangements, all sorts of entirely unsuitable people are given jobs because it's their country's turn or because there's balance between this group and that. I would hope that one could at least partly get, I think you're onto a really deep issue, and I don't say I can solve it totally, but I would hope that one could get some way towards impartiality by the idea that it wouldn't be something like the Security Council that would vote on it. It would be a court, and there would be, as it were, a constitution to the Federation, which would have criteria which would license intervention either to deal with a conflict or to prevent some terrible human rights abuse or genocide or whatever it would be. And I would hope that the people would be chosen to be on the court, not on the basis of their national affiliation. And so one might get around it that way. I would hope that I agree that it's difficult to do that, but on the whole, for instance, I think things are different in your country and in mine about judges. Here I think you elect judges, so that's rather different. But in my country, judges are appointed, which has its own drawbacks because they tend to be people rather like previous judges and people who went to certain schools, that kind of thing. But they are appointed on the basis of their legal qualifications rather than on the basis of we haven't had anyone from the north of England for some time. And so I would hope that we could do something along those lines to get around it. I must move on, though, to your second question, that respect may be a positional good. In other words, it may be that the kind of respect that nationalists want is recognition that they are superior rather than equal. And if that's the recognition that two groups each want, it follows by simple logic that they can't both have it. We can't say yes. It's only a very, very foolish kind of parent who says to each of two children privately, I love you better. But that's a recipe for disaster in parenting, and I think that any kind of thing of that sort will be a recipe for disaster in groups. That sort of demand for that kind of recognition, I think, is indeed impossible. So if someone says, we are the Heron folk, we demand recognition of our superiority, that they can't have. But a lot of people feel that they don't get minimal recognition. They feel that they're deprived of something much more fundamental than recognition of their superiority. For instance, Catholics in Northern Ireland, for many years, the boundaries of constituencies for Parliament were gerrymandered so that their votes counted for less. that kind of thing is an insult to a group of people, and I think that there are ways in which we can give people the sense that they're recognized as equals, much more than we do, even if we're not able to give them the impossible demand that both are recognized as superior.
There's a question here. Arna, can you bring the mic over there? Question right down there.
I have no illusion that you'll be able to give me the forthright answer to correct this problem. What I'd like to know is, what can we do to respect the United Nations Security Council when they've been hijacked, and how can they do any good when we're the singular power, as you state, in the nation, in the world?
When you say they've been
Practical problem with regard to the United Nations today, with a hijacked Security Council that is not very compatible with what we'd like to see happen.
Can I just ask, when you say not very compatible with what we would like to see happen, who are we?
The United Nations and the United States.
The United States. Okay, well, I mean, the thing is that there are two different views in the world. One is that a lot of people in the Islamic world believe that the United States hugely dominates the UN. A lot of people here believe that the Security Council has been hijacked by other people. What I want to say is that the present UN is obviously very imperfect. I wouldn't deny that for a minute. There are all sorts of people who vote for corrupt and terrible reasons on it. But I want to suggest ways of reforming it. I was suggesting this international court idea, for instance, so that we could move towards something which I hope would command rather more respect. The present Security Council is made up of roughly, the majority of it is the victors in the Second World War. Now, I am hugely glad that my country was among the victors of the Second World War, and we have had perhaps more influence than we deserve for many years after as a result of being on the Security Council. But on any rational basis, that historical thing would not be the answer to how we should decide things. And I would want a different system from the current form of Security Council. I don't know that really answers your question, but I'm suggesting reforming it rather than just saying it's wonderful as it is.
You spoke of several factors that led to the cycle of violence.
Sorry, I can't see where you are. Can you put up a hand? Right, thank you.
You spoke of several factors that led to the cycle of violence, one of which was humiliation, defeat, the need for recognition. But those things happened to Japan during World War II and did not lead to that cycle of violence. I would submit there's another factor, maybe religion, that history is replete with conflicts between Christianity and Islam throughout. And there's been a number of cases of humiliation of the Islamic groups over Christianity. The Islam group sees the United States as the center of that Christian power. And we spoke of those with might will normally cause them to take a lot of unilateral action, of which now the United States is the world's greatest power. And speaking of that international means of resolving conflict, and with the benign group of the body that you now admit that the UN is, what is the other solution? How can we bring that about an end to this conflict, especially with the religious
Well, it seems to me that you're making 2 points which are both very interesting. I think the citing of Japan as a counterexample to what happens when a country is defeated and humiliating is a very interesting point. I hadn't thought of that, and I will reflect on it. I'm not quite sure why it's different. That leads you to your second point, which is you're suggesting it may be the religious element is what leads to resentment. I think that there is a good deal of evidence in support of your view that religion is often of huge importance in this kind of cycle of violence and resentment. I mean, it's very striking, I think, that the great Balkan Wars And there's that Huntington thesis about the fault lines between different civilizations being partly marked by religions. The great Balkan Wars throughout the 20th century have been centrally between, on the one hand, Islam, on the other hand, Catholicism, and on the third hand, if I can muddle my metaphor a bit, Orthodox Christianity. There are two versions of Christianity and Islam, and it does seem that the deep divisions are between those. And indeed, when the Serbs attacked the Bosnians, one of the things they did was try to wipe out any traces of Islam in the territory that they conquered. They destroyed mosques, quite deliberately building car parks where they'd been and that kind of thing. They deliberately wanted to get rid of any trace of what they thought was the disgusting influence of the rival religion. I agree that religion is very powerful indeed, and even in conflicts where other things are clearly also important, religion is often the marker. I mean, talking about the Northern Ireland problem, carefully used the words nationalists and unionists, but people there often say Catholics and Protestants because the two groups just do hugely overlap, the two distinctions. I would like to be able to answer your question, say, well, what can we do about these nightmare spiraling religious conflicts? Once we get into them, it's incredibly hard. I mean, if you ask me about the conflicts with Islam and the Iraq situation, I mean, my recommendation would have been at the beginning not to have gone in, because I think it's going to be incredibly hard to get out, and it's hard to see how the current occupation, despite the handover to the Iraqi government, the fact that there are the foreign troops there from Christian countries, it's hard to see how that can fail to fuel a great deal of anger and resentment. I've tried to suggest that in the very long, slow process, we might be able to do something to defuse the passions with which religious hostilities exist by getting people to talk to each other in a more sophisticated way about the basis for their belief. But that's a very, very long, slow project. And I'm afraid I have to just share your pessimism about what to do in cases where there's a strong religious component at the moment. I mean, my recipe is try not to go to war with a country that has another religion if you can possibly help it.
I have received the official signal that we have one more question. Catherine?
Oh, okay. I'm very struck by your invocation of both Isaiah Berlin and Immanuel Kant, and if only because Berlin saw himself as needing to worry about the way in which it could be immolated on the principles that Kant brought to bear in moral philosophy. And I wonder, as you make this wonderful case, Professor Glover, for humanizing those with whom you're in terrible conflicts, and I think about how are we going to go about humanizing Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. What is it that we can do to come up with an alternative narrative about the brutality involved on both sides? I wonder how we are going to deal with the problem of evil, the way that it's constructed in political debate, the way that the problem of moral evil is used, deployed politically. What is it that we as philosophers can do to bring epistemology back into that political discussion? And then on the merits, getting away from epistemology, on the merits, grapple with the question of evil and dealing with the problem that Alan brought up, of people taking it very seriously, that they don't want to truck with evil, and that it's not a matter of I'm superior to you, it's that you're evil and I'm not. And that's a different kind of positional intractability than the Ubermensch version of it.
You asked a very difficult last question of the session. Let me first say that in quoting both Isaiah Berlin and Immanuel Kant, I wasn't suggesting they were necessarily in general agreement. I was just simply saying that Isaiah Berlin revived the Schiller idea about the bent twig, and that Kant had some good ideas about international authority. I'm sure that on many matters of moral philosophy they would have been hugely in disagreement, because Kant was not the kind of pluralist about values that Isaiah Berlin was. You then asked me really two questions, as I see it. One is about how can we construct a narrative which will somehow make possible some kind of reconciliation, perhaps with the kind of people who at present support Al-Qaeda. And you also asked me about the role of evil. I think those two are in a way related questions. I believe in being rather sparing with the use of the word evil to describe other people. I certainly think that there are acts which require very severe moral condemnation. I think the act of the attacks on 9/11 I include in those. I also include some of the things that have been done in the prison at Abu Ghraib in the occupation. I think there are terrible things that people do, and one wants strong words of moral condemnation. My worry about the use of the word evil is it's often used as though it was an explanation. And it seems to me a weak explanation. If one says, why did Al-Qaeda do what they did? If the answer is, they did what they did because they were evil people, that seems to me to tell me extraordinarily little about their motives. And similarly, if someone on the other side says, why did some of the Americans do what they did in Abu Ghraib? If the answer is they're infidels and evil, that again seems to me to tell me very little about what happened. And I believe that mutual name-calling, using the word evil, is one of the things that really does an enormous amount to make the world a much tougher place to live in and make it much harder for us to get on with each other. We shouldn't be sparing in our moral condemnation sometimes. And I don't want to suggest a kind of easygoing relativism that in the interests of making peace with people, we have to pretend that what they're doing is perfectly all right. We have to be clear that what they're doing is wrong. We have to be clear that sometimes what's done on our side is wrong too. And we have to invite them to engage in a dialogue. I mean, I think it's always said, we mustn't negotiate with terrorists. We can't have a dialogue with Al-Qaeda because they are terrorists. That used to be said in Northern Ireland. The IRA they bombed civilians, they killed many people in Northern Ireland. So there were terrorists on the other side in Northern Ireland too, unionist terrorists who also blew up many people. It was always said, we can't have these people at the negotiating table because they're terrorists. Nelson Mandela was sent to prison in South Africa after being convicted for terrorism. I am very glad that eventually the white South African government had the wisdom to release Nelson Mandela and engage in negotiation with him. I am very glad that successive British governments came round to the view that it was worth negotiating with people who represented the IRA. There's a light fiction that Sinn Féin isn't exactly the IRA, but they are so close as it gets pretty hard to tell the difference. In the long run, I think one sometimes has to swallow the anger and pride, which makes one say, I'm damned if I'm going to talk to those people. Sometimes one has to say, at what cost is this? How many lives are we going to have to lose in order to keep up this thing about not negotiating? I'd want to say that to the Israelis and Palestinians as well. Every time a suicide bomb blows up in Israel, I can see the feelings that the Israelis naturally have. How can we negotiate with the people who send young kids sometimes to blow themselves up just in order to kill women, children, men in an Israeli town? One can see the urge not to negotiate. One can similarly see the urge among Palestinians not to negotiate every time the Israeli army demolishes someone's village and drives them out and shoots people on the way. But in the long run, we only make peace through negotiation, and I think that there are some principles about not talking to terrorists, which in a way admirable in themselves, are bought at too high a price in human misery and suffering and death. And sometimes it's worth rethinking and trying to engage in a dialogue and negotiation.
this one. And I noticed that there are a number of students that have their hands up that we didn't get a chance to call on. Some of them perhaps were seeking a particular kind of biscuits that we could send back over. But in case they have additional questions, we are going to move in a minute to the Nelson Music Room. Doris and Suparna and the other ushers can take you through these doors, either to the elevator or direct you to the walkway to the second floor for a reception where there are more questions for Professor Glover. As these last series of questions indicate, we've all started to push and prod a little bit on recognition and respect, and how far you can draw the line from the prisoners in Broadmoor out all the way through the series of conflicts that you laid out for us. And there is both interest and, I think, skepticism in the audience, which is appropriate. And we are very much in your debt, because to have taken us from Kant and Hobbes through ideology and tribalism up through actual, however particular, practical suggestions for what to do is an enormous task in an evening, and particularly as what may turn out to be a fateful day for all of us and the world tomorrow is upon us, to have the longer view is welcome indeed. So we thank you again, and we're on to the reception.